Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for what promises to be a compelling and insightful conversation in the midst of some very challenging and uncertain times. My name is Vincent Sutherland. I'm the Executive Director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at NYU School of Law. And I want to welcome you to our conversation with Candace Jones, Kim Taylor Thompson, and Tony Thompson. I'm planning to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes about these times and the potential ways forward. And we're going to open up the chat for all of you to ask questions. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. And while we're not going to be able to answer them all, like I said, we're going to try and get through as many as we possibly can. So with that, without any further delay, let me just jump quickly into the conversation by introducing our panelists, and then we'll dive right in. Let me start with Candace Jones, who joined the Public Welfare Foundation in Washington, D.C. as its president and CEO in 2017. Public Welfare Foundation supports efforts to advance justice and opportunity for people in need. These efforts honor the foundation's core values of racial equity, economic well-being, and fundamental fairness for all. Previously, Candace served as a senior advisor at Chicago CRED, an organization that focuses on gun violence in Chicago. In that role, she worked on securing greater investments for violence intervention programs as an alternative to the criminal justice system in Chicago. Prior to her work there, she served as director of the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice, where she advanced significant reforms that reduced the number of youths in state custody. She also served as a White House Fellow, managing a portfolio within the U.S. Department of Education that included developing education strategies for correctional institutions and shepherding a plan to reinstate federal Pell Grants for youth and adults in custody. She is a proud 2007 graduate of NYU School of Law, and we're so pleased to have her with us today. Moving on to our next panelist, Kim Taylor Thompson, is a professor of clinical law at NYU School of Law and teaches courses related to criminal law and community and criminal defense. Her teaching and scholarship focuses on the impact of race and gender on public policy, in particular the criminal and juvenile justice policy, and the need to prepare lawyers to meet the demands of practice in and on behalf of subordinated communities. She founded the Criminal Justice Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, and as a member of the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Law and Neuroscience, engaged in interdisciplinary research, examine the ways that youth influences judgments in criminal behavior, and in doing so has helped advance justice in the treatment of young people by the criminal legal system. A brilliant scholar, incredible teacher, and gifted advocate. Before entering academia, he spent a decade at the DC Public Defender Service, ultimately serving as its director. And if you have not had a chance to see it, she was recently part of the PBS series Tell Me More, which featured Brian Stevenson, who chose her as someone that everyone should know. So let's welcome Kim.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, Anthony Thompson is a professor of clinical law at the law school as well, teaches courses related to criminal law, civil litigation, race, and leadership. He is a founding faculty director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law, and is author of numerous articles and books, including Dangerous Leaders, which explores the roles of lawyers and leaders and the type of preparation that law students and lawyers need to be effective leaders. He's also a co-author of A Perilous Path, where he engages in a candid conversation about race, law, and the future of America with some of the most brilliant legal minds of our time, including Cheryl Eiffel, Loretta Lynch, and Brian Stevenson. Before joining the faculty, he spent some time in private practice and about a decade as a deputy public defender in Contra Costa County, California. And if you can't get enough of Kim and Tony, they were recently featured on NYU's Journal of Legislation and Public Policy podcast, episode 2, Black Lives Matter and the Fights for Racial Justice. So let's welcome Tony as well. And let's just jump right into the conversation. So here we are, 2 days after Election Day, in the midst of election week. We're still trying to sort out and make sense of all this happened. And we're still awaiting results, in fact. What is clear is that our country is in desperate need of bold, transformative thinking on issues of race and inequality, if we hope to make some forward progress. And as I said at the outset, our hope today is begin to have a conversation about how we move forward from where we are right now. Now that said, I don't think we can move forward without looking at where we've been before. And so with that, Kim, I want to start with you and then hear from Candace and Tony. And let's kind of go back in time just a few years ago to 2016. And I want to hear about what your thoughts were in the context of race in America, and thinking about those election results, and where your head was at back then.
So thank you, Vincent. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And let me say thank you to the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law for hosting this conversation. We are, I think, all in the midst of feeling some level of anxiety around what's happening with this election, since it's still a bit uncertain. And so having a space to have this conversation, I think, is really important. So thank you for hosting it. But let me get back to your question. Kind of go back to 2016. Do I have to? All right. So what was going on, at least when those elections happened in 2016, was around race. I guess at the time I was feeling a level of anxiety right after the 2016 election. I was worried that sort of given the nature of the discussion during the campaign leading up to the election, and a number of the toxic comments that were made around race, that we were headed into a very difficult 4-year stretch. We had rhetoric that was talking about, that was stoking racial divisions, and attempting to create fear. We heard groups of color being labeled criminal. There were discussions about communities of color being infested with crime, almost suggesting that there's something akin to vermin happening in communities of color. And it was setting the stage, I think, for a number of fear-based policies and fear-driven policy choices. And so at the time, I was concerned about what that might portend for the next 4 years. And I also saw the 2016 results as being a backlash against, a president, and a Black president that we had had for 8 years. And so I sensed the significance of the racial moment, but I think I underestimated the depth of racism that would be tapped and unleashed in the coming 4 years. I held on to the hope, I think, at that time, that we would find a way to weather 4 years. And as a person of color who cares about communities of color in particular, I was worried about what the impact of the racism might be that we were seeing, not only in the policy choices, but the cabinet choices, the kinds of decisions that were being made at the time. And so I hoped that we would weather that, and people would see, and it would be exposed for all to see, that this was somebody that we were putting in a position of power who didn't have the competence, the level-headedness, the ability to unite that I think is critical in leadership. Instead, we had somebody that I thought we would see his racism, we would see incompetence, we would see his clear inability to lead. And that when we got to 2016, people would hopefully do the right thing and make a change. And what we see this week is that the popular vote shows that over 67 million people think that the country was going in the right direction under that leadership, and wanted more of the same. And so for me, it's a painful legacy from 2016 that suggests to me that we still have a lot of work to do on race, a lot of work to do on changing the racial narrative and understanding why it is that we continue to find ourselves in this position, and a lot of work to actually enable a vision that is more just, more equitable, more focused on racial equality.
Thank you, Kim. Candace, love to hear from you as well.
Thank you. So like Kim, I'm really glad to be here. I love to be sandwiched in between the two of them, and thrilled to be chatting, Vincent. I want to take your question and fan out a little broader. Kim and Tony both taught me, so they know I can never just take the assignment and do what I'm told. But I love it. And so I'll start by saying public welfare is nonpartisan. You know, we're 501c3, so we don't take a position. But I want to fan out on the issue of race and actually go back a little bit earlier to the point when we were talking in social science and pundits were saying we were in a post-racial America, right? Because that also wasn't that long ago. And it was so interesting in that moment in history when we were talking about, and for many of us who do work around issues of race, criminal justice, youth justice, and you're juxtaposing this national conversation about being in a post-racial America with what we know on the ground were still some very sort of tangible human rights horrors that were really targeted specifically at people of color, right? This was before, you know, Black Lives Matter was a full-blown branded movement, but we knew all the time that the incidences of violence between Black men and police were going on. We knew what was happening, you know, where there no cameras or phone cameras are available behind the walls in jails and prisons every day all over the country, both for youth and adults in custody. And so there was something really striking even in that moment in history when a lot of ways, from a liberal perspective, we wanted to sort of gloss over the history of this country and say, guys, we're past this. We're already sort of hitting the gas. We're past this moment. And then you get to a little bit after that, this moment where you're looking across the country, right, on the ground in these states and local jurisdictions in Arizona, where all of a sudden we need specific ballot measures to sort of review and check people's papers. It was also coming out of Florida at this time. So these tensions actually were starting to boil a little bit before we got to sort of later, the moment in history, certainly in the last couple of years and where we've arrived now, where you were starting to see in 2010, the ACLU wrote this wonderful report that I still don't think gets a lot of coverage, but it was called Banking on Bondage. And they were tracking that SEC filings of private prison companies. And what they have to note publicly for their filings were that they were pivoting to focusing on immigration because they felt like that was the true area of growth potential for their business. And being able to work with organizations, legislative organizations that train legislators and write model legislation all over the country, they would be able to work with them on the kind of thing that would deliver for them as a company the business model of the future, which is immigrant detention, along with what they were already doing in private prisons. And so I think there were a lot of things sort of in that last decade, a little bit more than a decade, that were setting up to the moment in history that we had in the last couple of years. I mean, the thing that resonates with me so much is the recent book by Isabel Wilkerson Cass, where she sort of says, if you focus on this moment, it feels really striking. If you pull out and you look at where this country has been going and you really analyze choices that people have made in the near term based on what really is a racial consciousness that they've been sort of trying to protect for the entire time, then things that have happened more recently, just they feel more obvious, but also more predictable. And I think that, you know, to Kim's point, we're seeing it, we saw it a couple of years ago, we're still seeing it, frankly, right now. And so I think I love this conversation because I think it will be so incumbent on us to sort of focus on where we're going, knowing that we have these long historical things yet to be acknowledged and fully dealt with.
Thank you, Candace. And Tony, love to hear your thoughts as well.
Not much to add to those two great points. I will say a couple things. First, before I get to some comments, in the more than 25 years I've been on this faculty, Candace Jones is one of the truly special people that have graduated from this law school. She's been a brilliant lawyer. She is in the leadership of philanthropy nationally. And when she actually had administrative responsibilities as director of juvenile justice, she was the most progressive cabinet member in any state cabinet in the country. Her approach to dealing with children was phenomenal. And I think I'm excited about the future of Public Welfare Foundation based on her leadership. That said, I want to join her in a bit of a broader look. I was not at all shocked in 2016 when I saw the results. Part of this is the influence of one of my mentors, Derek Bell, who talked eloquently and wrote eloquently about the permanence of racism in American society. And I think that both the 2016 and 2020 elections underscore the evolution of how America deals with race. What we saw was a massive loss of a narrative battle. We saw it in 2016 and we saw it again in 2020. What I mean by that is that we've seen a playbook and the evolution of white supremacy in America. And that playbook is to create a false narrative of racial progress, to identify a few exceptions to the standard, and then to move as though race is a part of our distant history. And that playbook was employed in 2016. It was honed and fine-lined essentially in 2020. I think that one of the things that I've seen in the last 4 years is a through line with the power of white supremacy and how both domestically, but also globally, how it has influenced the national and international discourse. And so I think that what 2016 represented was this evolutionary process of how race and inequality have been addressed. We saw profound economic inequality going into the 2016 election, and very little structural conversations about how to address that economic inequality. And we all know that that economic inequality in America tracks race. And so our inability to kind of address those issues, coupled with where popular culture was going, to build on what Candace had said earlier about this notion that we were post-racial because Obama had been in the White House for 8 years, was really a false narrative. And we didn't capitalize on the need to focus on a factual narrative about the economic and racial reality in America. So I saw 2016 and indeed Tuesday as an extension of that reality.
Yeah. So with that in mind, and I'm not going to ask Candace to weigh in on this question, but I want to hear from Tony and Kim. What did you expect to see happen on Tuesday night? What were you kind of looking? What were you hoping for, and what did you expect? Maybe the best way of putting it, knowing kind of all that we've seen over the last 4 years in terms of the policies and practices of this administration that have really, I think, given voice to, or at least put kind of action behind the sentiments that we all understood were peaking in many ways during the 2016 election season. Kim, why don't we start with you?
Okay. I guess I hoped, but wasn't confident that we would see a change in the Senate, that we would see a change in the leadership of the Senate and the control of the Senate, and that we would put a new administration in with a clear message and a clear mandate, a lot of votes behind it. Because I hoped that in the wake of the events over the summer, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the worldwide uprisings following those murders, demanding a reckoning on race, that we might see some reflection of that in the election results, that people would have heard what was happening. And as Candace had said before, when we didn't have cameras in places, we were now seeing on video things that people in my community have always known were true, that our interactions with the police are often lethal, that it takes less than 10 minutes to turn someone who looks like me into a statistic. So I saw this as hopefully a referendum on the last 4 years, and an effort to perhaps begin to think differently about where we go forward. Because in the last 4 years, what we saw was an open assault on Black and brown people by this administration. We saw a president unapologetically embrace organizations like the Proud Boys and other white supremacy groups. And we saw a president willfully mislead us on the pandemic. And even though that pandemic was having not only a lethal impact with over 200,000 deaths, but it was having a disproportionate impact on communities of color. Black people were twice as likely to die as a result of getting coronavirus. And we saw a country that was openly embracing this narrative of white supremacy and really beginning to think about ways that it could not only continue to embrace that, but to move it forward. Because people in this country were acting on this view that we should preserve our racial caste system. And so I thought that this election was a chance to raise our voices in opposition to those things. As a country, and Candace picked up on this a moment ago, we have a history of practicing silence on consequential issues. There are things we just don't want to talk about, we don't want to think about, we find it hard to talk about them, so we just avoid them, we stay silent. But what encouraged me and got my hopes up before this election was that we were finally beginning to talk about these issues. We were putting these issues squarely on the ballot, in my view, because we had very divergent views of where this country needed to go. So we were voting about racial equity. We were voting about equal justice. We were voting about a public health system that had made clear that there are deep racial and economic disparities in who gets access to public health and what outcomes you have when there are health issues in play. And as I said before, that referendum was on the ballot, but we were seeing that over 67 million people said, we're okay with the way things are. So they were embracing these regressive policies and were prepared to give this administration 4 more years to finish the job. And I found that really troubling. And I think that the reason why, and you know, I'm hoping that we will see, you know, a change in administration. But, you know, I think that what we're seeing is this deep divide, a deep racial divide in our country. And I believe that that's the result of 400 years of an unwillingness to grapple with these crucial questions, an unwillingness to look truthfully at our racial legacy and to confront our history, an unwillingness to do the hard work of acknowledging our sin here and then actually working to overcome that. And until we do that, we're not going to see the kind of progress that we need to see. So, Tony?
So let me say that I had a number of concerns going into Tuesday. I was concerned that had a decision been made on that day that the Democrats would win, that we would lose some of the fledgling progress we made on race. I was worried that we would telegraph the wrong message to America. I was worried that if the current administration was reelected, it would be able to build upon a hugely conservative majority in the Supreme Court and in the Senate. And I was worried, even if the administrations changed and the Senate changed, there was still a great bit of cultural work to be done. I can't say I was surprised. I mean, I think that even in the midst of the George Floyd responses and riots, that I didn't see the kinds of really serious messaging about voter suppression and some of the other things that we saw happening before the election being rejected. And so for me, it was a compilation of all of those different feelings going into the election.
I'll mute myself. So, you know, with all that kind of being said, and like, and as we step back and think about where we are right now, and even though there's still a lot of uncertainty around the result, we know that no matter what, it's going to be a very, very close outcome, one way or another. When we think about like where we want to go from here, what our next steps are, where we should kind of focus our efforts in terms of really advancing justice. Where do you see kind of opportunities in that particular space? You know, with a court that looks the way it currently looks, you know, comprised of a 5-4 majority that's not necessarily friendly to the issues we're talking about, with, you know, divided government in terms of a Senate that is unlikely to be controlled by legislators who are friendly to our concerns at the federal level. You know, and all the other concerns we have to dig out of with respect to this, with the coronavirus and all other things. Where do you see kind of opportunities for us to advance and make some progress? And let me start with you, Candace, on that question.
You know, the thing that I think is really important is I think this is a great building moment in history. What Kim said about the summer, you know, there are always these moments. It's like a window opens up and we're trying to wedge, you know, 400 years of sort of crimes, the sort of reparation for that into 3 months. And people exhaust, like Americans, I love us. We exhaust so quickly. And I'm tired. Are we still talking about that? We still talk about this summer. And so I think that this is a moment for sort of just like a dogged focus of building towards something. I really think that it's important, and I've been talking about this a lot in the work of criminal and youth justice, which is that I think there is going to continue to be some momentum in those fields, because I think there is a whole new, frankly, older generations who it hadn't resonated for them, this issue in the way, being fundamentally unjust before, in the way that it's starting to resonate now, just based on the availability of information. But a whole new young generation of folks who are coming up in a moment in history where this is so much a part of the ilk of what they're learning. And these are fundamental moments that will shape how they act as professionals for the rest of their lives, similar to what was going on in the world at the time the baby boomers were being born and sort of coming of age. So I think that is really going to be important. And I think for me, what I'd like to see is a lot of commitment to justice reform, because I think one of the things, especially for people who are hopeful about equity, racial equity, is that there's so many issues to exhaust us. You can feel like just constantly being bombarded, that you want to run off towards all these different fires. But I think it's so important for us to sort of have some focus and sort of say, these are some issues that we want to advance in real time. One of them, I think, has to be around racial equity, reparations, some of these issues that have been off the table for reasons none of us can sort of, in a way that philosophically makes sense, explain, but have been off the table for so time. But I think the necessity of those conversations and starting to build the momentum for them is really important right now. And I think the same is true around justice reform, the idea that so many years later, the sort of prevalence of Black and brown bodies in bondage in this country is still normalized is striking to me. And it's just sort of like, there's some issues that I think that we are going to have to really double down on and say, these are going to be our dogged issues, and we're going to advance those. And I think we're all going to have to play our position. I do hope that there's a set of stakeholders out there that will just be dogged about environmentalism, so that we can all be here to advance these other issues. But I think it's going to be really important to not sort of lose hope, lose focus, lose energy, and stay an important course, because I actually think that's a ploy to sort of get us off task. When I was a system leader, that was always something that I was thinking about. I would tell people, I was like, unfortunately, teams, individuals don't do 12 things well. They do about 3 or 4. And so what you have to do is pick those things and say to the world, it's not that the other things that you're identifying aren't important, but I can only advance a ball on a couple of these things, and I'm going to run hard down the field on these things and then come back for some others once I've got some momentum. And I think sort of as a community of people working towards racial justice, some of these justice reform issues in this moment in history, we're going to need to have that kind of dogged focus. Otherwise, I think we'll just be exhausted by all the potential things that could be happening right now.
Yeah. And thank you for that. And Kim, I'd love to hear from you. Kind of where do you see spaces for us to make some progress, and what do you think of as a strategy kind of moving forward?
Yeah, so I want to echo what Candace was suggesting, that if we have a focus and a vision of where we want to go, we're actually likely to get some things done. One of the things that Tony mentioned earlier was that we have a narrative battle that we have to fight. We constantly misunderstand the importance of that narrative battle. The narrative around Black folks and criminality is just so culturally embedded in this country and in our DNA almost, that we don't even question it. And so we have to constantly fight against that narrative, and constantly fight against the narrative of white supremacy, and begin to help people understand that it's wrong, it's fundamentally in error, and it's designed to actually divide us. And so let's start talking about it, not ignore it, but talk about it, expose it for what it is, and begin to do something different. We need a ground campaign around, sort of getting communities engaged in helping themselves and understanding what issues are in play. If the federal government isn't a place where we can actually advance many of our issues around racial justice and economic justice, then let's go to the local and state levels and start doing some work there. As Candace was saying, we have local governments and state governments at least primed to have conversations around race and justice, given the uprisings over the summer. So let's not squander the moment. Let's actually begin to move that and see some policy choices around that. You mentioned the U.S. Supreme Court. A lot of times we have in racial justice work, we have thought, well, let's take our battle through the courts and let's work our way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Well, the last place you want to go these days with racial justice issues is the U.S. Supreme Court. And so we're going to have to find ways to fight battles in other areas. Let me give you one example of what I mean. And it's a criminal justice example as well. The day after Amy Barrett was confirmed to the Supreme Court, states started filing dates for executions for people who were on death row. And the reason that they started filing those dates for execution was that they knew that if you take that up through the state appellate process, that state habeas process, and you go to the federal court and you ultimately go to the US Supreme Court, that death sentence is going to happen. There isn't a stop at the US Supreme Court anymore, given the 6-3 majority. And this Supreme Court has already made clear that they're willing to overturn stays that even state Supreme Courts issue. And so we're likely to see this court not only allowing those executions to happen, but states to actually make it happen more often, more frequently. And so we may get more executions given this change in the Supreme Court. What that means to me is that we need to double down on our efforts at the legislative level to get states to start repealing their laws that allow for the death penalty. We need to roll that back legislatively because there isn't an avenue in the court system. And so recognizing that we still have tools and we still have opportunities to really push for justice in lots of different ways, and making sure that we are fighting the ground game, I think is going to be critically important.
Tony, what about you?
I want to answer, and I want to throw a question back to the three of you, actually. So I think that there are a couple problems, frankly, with what my colleagues are saying. I think on one level, we did not see the commensurate change in the state legislatures either. So there are two problems with that. Number one, not to be partisan, but Republicans control 59, I think, of 99 state legislatures. They were complicit at best or advocating at worst in the voter suppression, voter ID, any attempts to inhibit votes from being counted. Secondly, they're going to control redistricting through this next process with the census. So I think on one hand, to respond to Kim, when I see governors like Gavin Newsom say, while I'm the governor of California, there'll be no executions. When I see the presumptive winner of the LA DA's office, George Gascon, saying, I'm going to reverse what Jackie Lacey has done, and I'm not only not going to pursue the death penalty, I'm in fact going to ask for resentencing hearings on those sentenced to death in the state of California from Los Angeles County. I think I'm optimistic when I look at that. But one question I have for the three of you is, have we as progressive people of color relied too much on an electoral system that is so easily manipulated and bent against us? And so my challenge or my task, my question from my colleagues and for the young people who are watching this, my students and those people out in the world, are there other levers that we should be pulling? And have we put too many eggs in the electoral basket, not only in 2016, but frankly, prior to that, when Obama was in office and we saw him hamstrung by a Senate unwilling to confirm a Supreme Court justice, saying it has to go to the next elected official, and then in the ultimate act of hypocrisy doing the exact same thing this year. So have we put too many eggs in that basket? And Vincent, let me start with you.
Of course, Vincent.
Great, thanks, Tony. Appreciate that. And Kim, thanks for reminding me there's a 6-3 majority. I actually misspoke.
Yeah,
and said
just forgot old Amy Barrett. Huh?
I can't put my head around. I can't put my head around it.
I know it's hard. It's hard.
That's a big part of it. I don't think that we have put too many eggs in the electoral basket. I think what we haven't done necessarily is hold those who elect accountable for the decisions they make. So I think the reality is that, to the extent that we are as people upset by or concerned with the issues that the elected officials that we put in office are dealing with or not dealing with in the ways that we want them to deal with, we can't kind of give them a pass. If it turns out that we have a new administration, all is not done. The fight does not kind of end there. And in fact, I think it's incumbent upon us to push even harder because we have at least a forum that we understand to be a little bit more receptive to the concerns that we have. And so the fact that George Gascon is in office or that Gavin Newsom is in office in California doesn't mean that folks can stop pushing and just be satisfied with having those people in positions of power doing things that we think are progressive and positive. It means that we should push them to go even farther because I view what they're doing as kind of the bare minimum. They're doing kind of the least at this point, right? I think we wasted a tremendous opportunity with having the Obama administration in office for 8 years. As many of the great things that he was able to do while in office, I think that there was a sense, this overwhelming sense for many that, we cannot criticize, we cannot push any harder, we cannot kind of ask for the ideal and seek the ideal. And we kind of ask for what we think we might be able to get and kind of be pragmatic about it. And it's up to government officials to be pragmatic. It's up to people in the streets to be pushing for the ideal. And so I think, it's incumbent upon us to use the electoral process because it is one of the levers that we have in the toolbox. It's not the only one, but I think it's an critically important one. The other things that I think of are, being a lawyer or being someone who's pushing for change means you have to use a whole range of tools. So it's not only voting, it's not only litigation, it's not only kind of fighting a narrative battle, it's also teaching and educating folks. It's also kind of doing the range of things that lead to change. These are kind of long-term struggles and long-term movements. And I don't think you can abandon one. But I do think you have to kind of be strategic about when you focus on one over the other. And so I think that's how I would kind of couch it myself.
I'll jump in. I love that. I want to build on Vincent's point. So when I served in state government, actually, I served under both a Republican and a Democratic administration. And sometimes it's sort of difficult to remember that. And I would always tell people is that that wasn't the issue that mattered. In sort of getting, I was a leader with a principal vision working towards an end, but I was like, when you got to the politics were strikingly the same. And I think that's one of the dangers of presuming that there's some partisan place where issues around racial justice, criminal justice reform have been frankly meaningfully advanced in the past and therefore will magically all of a sudden become a real priority agenda. I think that it is really important to diversify our strategies. And I think specifically about philanthropy as a field because we give money and we have a lot of power to sort of say which voices are important. And I think we have had an outsized investment in policy groups and research groups and groups that really do a certain type of work. And I think that that's been at the expense of saying, okay, but we're also gonna invest in the kind of organizing that fuels movements like Black Lives Matter or the racial justice uprisings that we've seen, that we give the sort of resources to community to come up with alternatives to incarceration, alternatives to being so heavily reliant on policing. And I do think that lack of employing diverse strategies has cost us something in these movements. Frankly, I think they've cost us something in policy movements because a lot of times we are arguing for something that we haven't fully demonstrated because we haven't made the investment, we haven't made the bet. Justice reinvestment at the federal level was a great example of that, talking about we wanted to reinvest resources from deep end systems. Most of those resources went into other levers of the systems as opposed to going into building the kind of continuum of care that would make us rely less in criminal justice on systems, period. And so I do think that, while I don't think we should abandon any of the strategies, we definitely have some handicaps, some weak spots that if we're sort of, the analogy is that we're at the gym, there's muscles that we haven't been working, and it's cost us. And I agree, it's cost us even in holding account, to Vince's point, in holding those policy levers to account, because without a strong organizing base, it's like the thing you do on one day every 4 years is not going to be the thing that changes your lived experience in your city, state, town. It's what you do, frankly, after that. And I think I've seen that throughout time. It's sort of like, don't just be charged up about that one day, be charged up about holding systems and leaders to account for all the things they said up until that moment. Like that's sort of that's the least of it. It's the follow through. And I think in a lot of ways, because we haven't resourced other levers, we haven't invested in these other strengths, we don't give people the strength and organizing base to be able to do that in a really robust way.
If I could just pick up on what Candace just said, this notion that we can sort of just sit back and every 2 years or every 4 years, we're going to do something. And that's when we're going to reach out to marginalized communities. That's when we're going to go out and say, here's what this administration can do for you, or here's what this elected official can do for you, is crazy. We actually do need to be in there day in and day out. And it's one of the things that I love about what Public Welfare Foundation does, is that it looks for people on the ground who are actually looking at their communities and saying, what do I need to do to make my community safe? It doesn't mean I need to put a prison over here or this many police officers, but it's people within the community saying, here are our issues. I understand them. Here's some things that I think that we need to do. Let's try to do something that's a little bit different. And what so often happens in criminal justice policy and policy across the country is that we come up with these ideas somewhere over here, and then maybe towards the end we bring in the communities that are going to be affected by the policy and say, what do you think now? They need to be part of the structure of building it, identifying it, figuring it out, and that's where we need to start investing. I want to share a story from a friend of mine who was doing some election canvassing in the days leading up to this past election. She was working in Dover, Delaware, in a marginalized community, a poor Black neighborhood. And she met with a Black man and asked him, if he was planning to vote and for whom. And he said he was undecided, but that he thought he probably would vote for President Trump. And when she asked him why, he said, well, Trump sent me money. Now, you may remember that those stimulus checks went out and Trump held up those checks going out so that he could get a signature on them. And apparently that had an impact because we weren't in that community until 2 days before the election. We weren't helping them understand what the impact of policies were and how it was affecting that community. And so when he said that, my friend, her eyes were wide. How could you feel that way? He felt that way because we had not spent any time with him up until those 2 days before. We need to start working in communities to help them understand what policies help them and help us understand what they need so that we can actually develop the policies that will move us forward, not just sort of as a last minute, last ditch effort. It has to be part of how we operate. So getting back to Tony's point, to your point, Tony, I think that we need to use a range of tools that are at our disposal and that we tend to ignore until like right at the last minute.
So Vincent, let me just interject one other thing before I turn it back to you. And that is to say that both you and Candace and said directly, and Kim alluded to this notion of holding people to account. And one of the things that we haven't done well is we haven't gotten past elected officials' rhetoric. And so when I look, for example, if we're going to do work on the local level, New York has a mayoral election coming up next year. If I look at that election and I look at the current mayor of New York, who ran on a reform the police agenda, and then essentially did nothing to lessen the danger to people of color in the city of New York from the New York Police Department. I think when we look at the race in New Orleans for district attorney that's coming up, to say to those DAs, will you, if you are elected, allow an independent organization to come in and audit what you've done with regard to racial equity? Will you allow an external organization to look at your data? When we look at Kim Foxx in Chicago, in Cook County, that state's attorney has published her data on her website so that independent organizations, and I should say, much to her demise. I mean, the Chicago Tribune went after her around that data, but she put it out there. And I think we have to say, it's not only that you're going to say the right thing, Mayor de Blasio, but you're going to create an independent civilian review apparatus. You're going to create an advisory board of citizens from communities that can come in and hold you to account in between elections. Because as Kim said, and I think it's exactly right, it's not good enough to do it every 2 or 4 years. And so I think one of the things that we have to add to our toolkit is this new level of accountability when people are articulating a vision that we think is progressive. So I think that that's going to be, for my young people who are listening, that's got to be part of our organizing strategy. It's got to be part of our town hall strategy. And it's got to be part of our commitment before we endorse candidates.
Can I just build on that, Tony? Because I think that's so powerful. And the one reason I just want to sort of draw a fine line under it is because it happens now. It's just not us doing it, right? When a mayor comes into a city, the reason they're always skittish about police reform is because they do not want that union coming after them. They are very cautious about the choices they make because the organized base there, they know they will have to account to. Same way when people in, governors come in and they're saying, oh, we want to do prison reform. All of a sudden that corrections union or some of those organizations, they're very cautious about what they say and how they frame it because they know they will be held to account. Can you imagine if folks organizing in community were galvanizing that same sort of level of fear in some of these folks so that they would be saying, okay, we got to make some really targeted choices here because we're going to be held to account for whatever decision we make. So I just wanted to.
I appreciate it. I want to hold the Black police officers to account. I want to hold Black prosecutors to account. The National Organization of Blacks in Law Enforcement, the Guardians of Justice, 100 Blacks in law enforcement, all have a responsibility to say, we will not participate in this union unless you have some accountability in our communities. And so law enforcement unions need to be reimagined. This is not just defund the police and rethink policing. This is rethink unions around law enforcement and create some community accountability. If we don't do that, we can never reform the basic functions of policing. I'm sorry, Vince, I didn't mean to get too far afield on your questions, but I wanted to make those points.
No. I think this is right in line with the kind of conversation we want to have. So no worries at all. Before we kind of open up the Q&A for folks to ask any questions they might have that we can maybe give some answers to, I wanted to just ask one last question of all of you all. What gives you hope right now in this moment that we're in? Knowing that the results are uncertain, knowing that what we are facing either way. I read the other day that kind of the best case scenario, if there's a change in administration, still we have a mountain of problems and a mountain of concerns to deal with. And so I'm curious to hear from you all, what gives you all hope as you scan kind of the field? Candace, let's start with you.
I have a ton of hope, actually, and it goes so much against type, but it really is. I know, and it was during the uprising of the summer. I was like duly exhausted and really hopeful. I said it before. I think the generation of people coming up in this moment in history are going to shape the world. We have to, keep it sound enough to be able to deliver them something that they can work with, not completely destroy it in the time. But I'm really hopeful. I just think that even more than my own generation, we're going to have a generation of people who are visionaries and who their unwillingness to accept the status quo or be gaslighted is just going to be very different than even some of that. We've run the ball as far as we can, but I think they're not going to be as patient as some of the generations that have preceded us. And that makes me hopeful, so much so. And I told this to Kim, I was like, I don't know, it might be time for me to just sort of train up a few more and then, exit stage left myself. I'm so hopeful. I'm so encouraged in this moment of history, because it feels like, especially if you've been doing work around criminal youth justice, and I look to Kim and Tony, it feels like the cavalry's finally coming. Not that the work is done, but just the potential of the awakening happening in this moment, I think makes me hopeful. And I know that there is so much that we still have to do, because I tell people all the time, I was like, we cannot sort of start to celebrate premature victories. There's so much human suffering that still happens every day in this country. But I do think that I do feel like there's finally a sort of new generation of folks that are coming over the hillside that make me hope that the future is going to advance more quickly, more critically on these issues than they have in the past.
Tony?
Fantastic. Tony, let's hear from
Yeah,
you.
Kim wants to have me go next rather than last because she knows that my answer to this. My hope is shaded a little differently. I am faced with the reality that roughly half the country supported the current administration and essentially voted for white supremacy. I think that Detroit in 2021 looks a lot more like Detroit during Reconstruction, or the South during Reconstruction. The voter suppression there has been phenomenal. But I think to the extent that there's hope, the young people in my classes obviously make me feel hopeful. I think that they're smart and principled and aggressive about racial and social justice. But I think that the reality is that we're still looking for a narrative of racial progress that doesn't exist in this country. And the reality is that the racism that exists and that creates profound economic inequality and racial injustice is part of the permanent fabric of this nation. And that reality means that our work is a longer term work with fewer peaks of progress than I think we've seen, and more hard hat, shovel, and lunch pail every day. And I think that the reality is if people understand that, then the progress will be real progress and not fleeting. So I think that that's my perspective based on what I've seen.
Great. Thanks, Tony.
So I guess I share a bit of both Candace's view and Tony's view. I was incredibly hopeful as I watched people come out of their homes in the middle of a pandemic, running a risk of their health and everything else in terms of speaking out against police brutality. And it gave me hope that there were so many people of good conscience that were willing to jump out there and say, this will not be tolerated. We will not be silent. We will no longer be complicit. And that actually gave me hope. So we're beginning to see things that I think give us hope that a conversation is happening in institutions where it hasn't happened. We're seeing banks get engaged in different kinds of conversations. The LA Times just recently in September put out on its opinion page, here's what we said about super predators back in the 90s. We were wrong. We did this. They exposed themselves and owned up to it. I think that kind of truth and reconciliation gives me hope as well. But the thing that I think that gives me the most hope is something that my colleague Lindsay Kendrick made me remember. She was telling a story about her grandmother and our ancestors, and that when you're feeling at your worst, you really do need to think back to those souls and call on their strength, because our grandparents, great-grandparents, our ancestors fought these battles with so much less than what we have, with so much less education, less resources, less of a community around them enabling these things to happen. And they got us here. So if they could do that with as little as they had, we certainly should be able to get to a better finish line and do it in a shorter amount of time. So that gives me hope as well.
Fantastic. Those are all really great reasons to be hopeful. I just want to remind everybody that the Q&A is open. So if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. I have a couple more questions for our panelists that I can ask.
Wait a second, Vincent, what makes you hopeful?
Oh, so I think it's a little bit of all of the above. I see in the folks who are kind of taking to the streets over the summer, a resilience and a kind of a no nonsense attitude. They're not going to settle for half measures. That they're kind of radically reimagining what our world should look like. And I say radical not in the sense that it's far-fetched or out of this world, but radical in terms of it's dramatically different from what we're currently living through. And I think what their vision is a vast improvement over what we're living through right now. I'm hopeful because there are so many people who are engaged. One of the things I found really striking, and this is not it was in many ways surprising to me was that when I looked at the protests over the summer and the uprisings over the summer, it wasn't just Black or brown people who were in the streets. It was white people, uh, Asian people, people of all races, all walks of life, all classes, all concerned about racial justice. Now, the question is was that a 1 month or 2 month or 3 month thing, or is that indicative of a longer term personal commitment to really change the course of our country's direction? And I'm hoping that it's the latter. I know that I've had a lot more conversations with folks about issues of race than I've ever had up till this point, which I think is also a sign that people are kind of, their consciousness is raised about the deep-seated concerns that our country has been birthed in and rooted in. And I think I'm also hopeful because I don't think we have really much of a choice, quite frankly. I think if we don't plant our feet and look around the world, look at the world around us and see where we've come from and where we have the capability to go, then we're missing the big picture. I don't think that this fight is a fight that's going to end in my lifetime or any of our lifetimes. I think of this as a long distance relay race where you do as much work as you can with the time that you have, and you pass the baton on to the next group of folks who are going to pick up that torch and keep on fighting. And so I think, are we going to end the carceral state by the end of my career? I don't know. But I'm going to do everything I can to push for that. Are we going to end racism? I don't think so. But I'm going to do everything I can to help confront it and address the ways in which its harms flow to all of us. And I think that's a fight that we all have to engage in. I don't think we have any choice but to be hopeful. With that, we have one question in the Q&A. What are your thoughts on how to fight disinformation and conspiracy theories like QAnon? Which, it's a very real question, particularly as we think about kind of this narrative battle that folks have talked about. So I'm curious to hear folks' thoughts on that. How do we fight disinformation? And even think about this disinformation piece, not only conspiracy theories like QAnon, but this boogeyman of voters of vote fraud, and which kind of feeds into efforts to suppress the vote more generally. How do we fight these kind of this disinformation? So Candace, let me start with you.
I mean, I think one, systemic way I think that we have to fight that is, frankly, we have to police better. Media has become much more diffuse in how people get information. We know this is really significantly evolved in the last couple of decades. And frankly, how we police our tech companies is a big part of that. They play a massive role, have played for a long time. And I think for reasons that they advance and then critics advance, have been reluctant to police some of the way that theories, that information is spread. And because so many people, unfortunately, get their information from those platforms now, they really can end up in this echo chamber of disinformation. And so I think it's going to be really important that we police our tech companies' policing of that disinformation. And I think that people, as we want to argue for free speech and the limits of what is still essentially for the purposes of the law, new technology, that's sort of a difficult thing. But I frankly think from a systemic change, that's the way that we're going to have to manage that lever, because it really is a major function of what is now these new platforms of how people get information.
So I completely agree with you, Candace. There's one twist I want to put on that, though, and that is that in communities of color, we've benefited from social media. If you look at what happened with Ahmaud Arbery, if you look at what happened with Trayvon Martin, without the power of social media, the work of those prosecutors and law enforcement would have gone unexposed. And so I think it is very important, as I say to my students all the time, to tell our clients and tell people in the community within a legal distance to use video cameras on their phones, to take video of police conduct, to see when misconduct happens. I think that the same thing is true with social media. When we see instances of injustice, without social media, we would not have had the Trayvon Martin case come and and the Ahmaud Arbery prosecution happened. I think it's critically important that we use social media in ways that benefit exposure and accountability. But I think Candace is right. I think we should demand a regulatory responsibility on what their responsibilities are in terms of putting forth that information.
Okay, all right. So we're right up close to 1 o'clock. Just want to see if anybody has any. Oh, it looks like we have one other question. And this looks like it might be the last question we get a chance to answer. The question is there enough of a voice to counter the white supremacists? And I think that's a really compelling question. So Tony.
Let me say that white supremacy happens on a lot of levels. I think when you use the bully pulpit of the White House to support it, it's very hard to counter that voice. But I think that in communities where we've seen anti-fascists push back against white supremacist rallies and organizations, that's been a positive force. But I think that it's connected to a movement globally. It's connected to a movement nationally. And so I think it is something where we have to be vigilant all the time. And we have to make sure where we have pulpits, we use those to denounce it. But I think that it's work that's never done.
I also just think there's a vitriolic message that comes out of that movement is so, it carries such weight, it's so stunting that's part of it. It's like in the raw numbers, do I think that we can come up with other powerful voices? Yes. Do I think that sort of the wins against such a vitriolic message are going to be easy to sort of overcome? That's what makes it so difficult, both that is coming for the bully pulpit, but just sort of any message, and they do psychology about how people respond to positive or negative affirmations. Like that's part of what the issue is. It's such a vitriolic message to begin with. And so I think that when we're talking about narrative change, we're going to have to stay the course really intentionally on reframing how we think about some of these core issues and sort of pushing back against that, because it's not just the sort of raw numbers or incidences of that voice. It's just the nature of the message.
Kim, anything you want to add?
No, given our time, I won't add. I would just say that I echo what Candace and Tony have said.
Okay, all right.
Vincent, before we go, let me just publicly thank Kelly Spencer, who has been fabulous in her support in the center and in her work in the university and the law school generally.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. That was so first of all, I want to thank all of you for joining us and for such a wonderful conversation. Hope you're able to join us on next Thursday, November 12th. That will be the 25th Derek Bell Lecture on Race in American Society. It'll be a Zoom webinar from 6 to 7:30 p.m. If you go on the center's website, rather than give you a long website name, just Google Race NYU Law, Center on Race and Equality in the Law, NYU Law. You'll go right there. You'll find a link to that to register there. And as Tony said, I want to thank Kelly Spencer and Joseph Pellicone from the Office of Development and Alumni Relations for helping us pull all this together. And again, thank all of our panelists for a wonderful conversation. And we'll see you all on the other side.
And thank you, Vincent, for such great moderation. It was really great.
Great. All right. Take care, everybody.